May the 11th, this is the last day of instruction before our final test, and this is, of course, is the prophets, Isaiah through Malachi. So we are on the prophet Haggai. Haggai is pronounced Chagai. That's one way, or Chagay, okay? It's pronounced both ways. And it means festival of Yahweh or Jehovah. The Hebrew word for festival is Chag, okay? Haggai is mentioned 11 times in the Old Testament, 9 times in the book of Haggai, 2 times in Ezra. You all know about the book of Esther, the historical book, okay? He's mentioned 2 times there. 2 verses in Haggai could be referred to in the New Testament. Haggai 2:6 is quoted in Hebrews 12:26. Haggai 2:6 is partially quoted in Matthew 24:29 and Mark 13:24-25, and Haggai 2:21 is partially quoted in Matthew 24:29 and Mark 13:24 and 25. Prophetic facts and length of book. Haggai is divided into 2 chapters, a total of 38 verses. There are at least 4 prophecies. There are 15 prophetic verses out of 38 verses, making Haggai 39% prophetic. The only prophetic book shorter than Haggai's 38 verses is Obadiah's 21 verses. Haggai refers to the tribulation period and the millennial temple, as well as the desire of all the nations. Does anybody know who that is or what that is? The desire of all the nations. What is that? The Messiah. So date and author. The date of Haggai's prophecy is 520 BC. The MacArthur Study Bible states, by the way, you notice just on this first page, on virtually all the information you need to know about Haggai is almost on the first page here. Okay. The MacArthur Study Bible states, quote, "There is no ambiguity or controversy about the date of the prophecy. The occasion of each of his 4 prophecies is clearly specified in chapters 1:1, 2:1, 2:10, and 2:20, occurring within a 4-month span of time in the 2nd year of 520 BC of Persian king Darius Hystaspes, who reigned from 521 to 486 BC. The 4 prophecies, and if you really work it out, the 4 prophecies were given in the space of 111 days. And then I actually put down the dates. I translate Elul 1, Tishri 21, Chislev 24, Chislev 24. Works out to August 29th, 520, August the 17th, 520, December the 18th, 520, and December the 18th, 520. So from August 29th to December the 18th, that's all 4 prophecies are within that date. August 29th happens to also be the date of my anniversary, okay, my wedding anniversary. Biography of Haggai, okay, here's what we know about him. Charles L. Feinberg states, quote, Haggai is one of the prophets whose personal history is unknown. He was probably born in exile. So now, just like some of the other prophets we talked about, there's going to be a whole lot written about saying how we know nothing about the guy. But you'll see, but they'll be expressed in very scholarly terms to make it sound like they know something. The MacArthur Study Bible states, quote, the list of refugees in Ezra mention nothing of Haggai. There are no indications of his parentage or tribal ancestry, nor does history provide any record of his occupation. Unquote. This prophet is the only person with the name Haggai. Because his name is derived from the Hebrew word for festival, Chag, a few scholars therefore suppose that he was born on a feast day, but nothing in the text supports this view. In other words, you know, they're grappling at straws to try to find, we got to find something about this guy that we know about, but nothing that you really know for sure. Lindsay, he's the author that wrote, you know, in this book right here. Lindsay further states, scholars believe his reference to the Solomonic temple in Haggai 2:3 shows he was one of the exiles who saw it destroyed in 586 BC. If so, he may have been an elderly prophet. Now, look at the key words here. So he gives a statement And then he says, if so, what does that mean? We're not sure. But if he was one of those guys, he may have been an elderly prophet. So in other words, they don't know. But they're guessing he probably was. J. Vernon McGee states, quote, Haggai is mentioned in Ezra 5, chapter 1 and chapter 6, as one of the two prophets who encouraged the remnant that returned after the Babylonian captivity to rebuild the temple in spite of the difficulties that beset them on every hand, unquote. Historical background and setting. Concerning the Jews in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army destroyed Solomon's temple and the city of Jerusalem. The Davidic kingly line was cut off when Jehoiakim and the nation were taken to Babylon as captives where the Jews would remain for 70 years. Okay, as we pause here for a second, since we went over the test, your final test, did you notice that was one of the things that I asked about? I mentioned it more than one time, but the Davidic kingly line was cut off when Jehoiakim and the nation were taken to Babylon as captives where the Jews would remain for 70 years. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar was responsible for that. That's what God used Nebuchadnezzar for, was to destroy the city and to temporarily terminate the Davidic line. The MacArthur Study Bible notes, quote, in 538 BC, as a result of the proclamation of Cyrus the Persian, Ezra chapter 1, Israel was allowed to return to her homeland under the civil leadership of Zerubbabel and the spiritual guidance of Joshua the high priest. About 50,000 Jews returned. Out of the, say, million or so, or millions that are now in Babylon and scattered throughout the Babylonian Empire and the former Assyrian Empire, only 50,000 return. In other words, a remnant returns. In 536 BC, they began to rebuild the temple. Opposition from neighbors and indifference by the Jews caused the work to be abandoned, according to Ezra chapter 4. 16 years later, Haggai and Zechariah were commissioned by the Lord to stir up the people to, one, rebuild the temple, and to reorder their spiritual priorities. 4 years later, in 516 BC, the temple is completed, as in Ezra chapter 6. So in other words, Haggai, along with Zechariah the prophet, God raised them up to stir the people up to rebuild the temple. Now, as we talk about, I just want to mention the difference between Haggai and Zechariah right now. Zechariah was the visionary. He was literally, he had like 8 visions in one night. If you read J. Vernon McGee, he says that he had 10 visions in one night. He was a visionary. His head was always in the clouds. He was basically giving the people direction as to where they're going. Haggai is the Old Testament book of James, a very practical book. The people come up to Haggai and said, how are we going to become spiritual? What do we need to do? Haggai points towards the hills and he says, well, there's the trees. Cut them down, make timber, make smooth boards and stuff like that, and rebuild the temple. In other words, he just said, get to work. That's how you can be spiritual. What about prayer and all that? No, he says, get to work. He says, it's time to work, okay? That was basically what he said. So he was very practical. So now I have a biography here of Darius, okay? So remember, in your final exam, he's one of the people I mentioned, okay? Darius, pronounced Daryavesh. So if people argue, is it Darius or is it Darius, it's neither one of those. It's Daryavesh. That's how you actually pronounce it, okay? And it means restrainer. King Daryavesh, Hystaspes, reigned from 522 to 485 BC. He is not the same person as Darius the Mede in Daniel 5:31. That is a different Darius, okay? MacArthur Study Bible states, quote, Darius I, Hystaspes, became king of Persia in 521 BC, having ascended to the throne after the death of Cambyses as an officer of Cambyses and the great-grandson of Cyrus the Great's brother. Darius or Darius retained the loyalty of the Persian army and defeated other contenders for the throne. If the army is on your side, there's a good chance that you're going to get what you want. King Darius, or King Darius, made Shushan or Susa his new capital and created a code of laws similar to the Code of Hammurabi. He developed trade, built a network of roads, established a postal system, standardized a system of coinage, weight, and measures, and initiated fabulous building projects at Persepolis, Ecbatana, and Babylon. In 520 BC, according to Haggai 1:1 and Zechariah 1:1, the Jews resumed work on the still unfinished temple in Jerusalem. Darius assisted with the project by ordering it to continue, and even sending a generous subsidy to help restore worship in the temple. If you remember in Esther, I know when you had your last course on all the historic books, there was a lot of opposition to the Jews rebuilding, and remember they sent a letter to Darius, and the opposition, remember Tobias and all of them, there was great opposition to rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the walls and all that stuff, and they wanted the Jews to stop the work, and so they Darius had them search the archives, saw the law that was written by Cyrus the Great, and then Darius, he sends back a memo or another law stating, if you get in the way of the Jews, basically he said, I will destroy you. And as a matter of fact, you're going to collect taxes and you're going to help them rebuild the temple. So in other words, he took the enemies that were against the Jews and he made them foot part of the bill. The final years of Darius's reign were marked by clashes with the rising Greek Empire. He led 2 major military campaigns against the Greeks, both of which were unsuccessful. He was the king of Persia until his death in 486 BC. Okay. Now I also got just a little bit of information about Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest. So Zerubbabel, pronounced Zerubbabel, it's a soft B, means born at Babylon. It also means, what does Babylon mean? It means confusion. So Zerubbabel means born in confusion, born of confusion, if you took the whole complete name. So Zerubbabel was the son of Shealtiel and the grandson of Jehoiakim. Now who's Jehoiakim? He's the king that was taken captive to Babylon, okay? The captive king of Judah, 1 Chronicles 3:17. Zerubbabel was Jehoiakim's legal successor and heir. But remember, Jehoiakim was cursed by God. God promised no son of yours will ever sit on the throne of Judah again. So even though Zerubbabel was a crown prince, he could never be a king, according to what God said. He has the unique status of being descended from 2 of King David's sons by Bathsheba, Solomon and Nathan, in Joseph and Mary's genealogies. So if you look at the genealogies in Matthew, it goes from David through Solomon through Zerubbabel to Joseph, and then David, Nathan, Zerubbabel, the Heli, Mary's father. So in other words, they both converge in Zerubbabel. With King Cyrus's blessing, Zerubbabel returned to Jerusalem and was one of the instrumental people in the rebuilding of the Second Temple. Scholars designate the Second Temple as Zerubbabel's temple. So oftentimes you'll hear there's Solomon's temple, then there's Zerubbabel's temple. Zerubbabel's temple, you know, it went through a lot of building upgrades and was eventually renamed Herod's temple. They just kept rebuilding, and it's kind of like you got a shack. You know, the hillbilly, you know, becomes a millionaire, and he says, I'm just going to live in the same house. I might add a few more rooms, and there's the shack, becomes like the entrance to the front door of his mansion right behind it. That's kind of like Zerubbabel's temple and Herod's temple. Joshua the high priest. Joshua is also called Jeshua in English. I want to write this out for you. Now, if you had your Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, you know that this name right here is translated in Greek as this. Well, this is what you get in English, Jesus or Jesus. Jeshua also is translated this. This is a different form of it. And if you were Hebrew, you would be saying it this way. Yeshua. So that's actually the Hebrew name of Jesus. Mary, now that's her anglicized American name. Mary's real name is Miriam, right? Miriam, okay. Miriam wouldn't call Jesus from the playground. She would say, Yeshua, please come home. So, just to give you an example. Remember, they didn't use English names. They used Hebrew names back then. English was a pretty guttural language back then. In fact, English and German were actually like the same language back in that day, until they like diverged, you know. Yeah, German and English are not a part of the Romance languages, you know, Romanian, Italian, Latin, Spanish, Italian, you know. English and German are much more guttural, you know, much more, they don't flow as nicely as, like, say, Italian or Romanian or something, or Spanish. I had to mention Spanish. Okay, so so Jeshua, pronounced Yeshua, means salvation of Yahweh. Okay, Yeshua is the first captive mentioned in Ezra 2:2. That returned with Zerubbabel to Judah. His father Josadak had been exiled, and 1 Chronicles 6:15 mentions that. He came from the lineage of Levi, Aaron, Eleazar, and Phinehas. In other words, he's in the line of the high priest that will actually go into the millennium. Yeshua, along with Zerubbabel, led the way in building the second temple. So again, Yeshua is the Hebrew, Jeshua, the Hebrew is Yeshua, and it's the name Jesus. It means Jehovah is salvation. Hebrew Christians, Messianic Jews, refer to Jesus by his Hebrew name, Yeshua. They still call him Yeshua today. So then I have a bunch of key dates for you, which I'm not going to read off, but let's take a look at a theological theme of Haggai. Charles Swindoll states, quote, with a single eye on his objective, he, Haggai, pursued one major goal: to complete the project of rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. The MacArthur Study Bible states, Haggai revealed in the supreme glory of the ultimate messianic temple yet to come. Okay, those are the themes. Those
to finish the temple and what?
What's that?
Those to finish the temple and what was the second one?
According to the MacArthur Study Bible, Haggai revealed in the supreme glory of the ultimate messianic temple yet to come. In other words, when they looked at Zerubbabel's temple, he says, don't look at this small edifice, but what's to come is going to be the messianic temple. And in Jewish eyes, in biblical eyes, from Solomon all the way to the millennial temple, God views them as one temple. But the final temple in its ultimate state will be, remember that's written about in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 40 through 46. And that's the millennial temple. And Haggai is saying, God is saying through Haggai, look to that temple where literally where the Messiah is going to be worshipped from. Okay. Just a very brief commentary on Haggai. All four messages were given in the second year of King Darius of Persia in 520 BC. And then I already gave you the dates. So the first message is God's priority of rebuilding the temple. That was to replace the people's concern in building their own luxurious homes. In other words, when opposition occurred, the people said, must not be God's will. Well, let's build our own houses. So God makes a big point of saying how you had lots of time and money and put lots of effort into building your own homes. He mentions the wood paneling you put inside the homes. In other words, they really fixed up their homes nice. So the people respond with renewed zeal to build the temple 23 days later on September the 21st. The delay due to the harvest of crops and gathering of building materials. Remember, God says rebuild the temple, but they hadn't done anything for 16 years, so it takes a while to go up to the hills, cut down the trees, make lumber, and then when they get all their building materials, then they get back to work. The second message on October 17th, God declares he will be with the people. There would be a national cleansing and a future glorious temple in the millennium to worship the Lord. Third message, the priest's decision to show the present blessings of obedience. In other words, the priests are going to lead the way in showing how important it is for the people to obey the Lord. It says if the priests aren't doing it, people are saying, well, if God's own priests don't obey, why should we obey? That was their thinking. So the priests, God says the priests must set the example in being obedient to the Lord. Then he also states on December the 18th, which is Kislev 24th of December. I'm sorry, 24th of Kislev, December the 18th. Cleansing must occur in order for God to bless the people. Sin must be confessed so their offerings would not be contaminated. In other words, sin is contagious, righteousness is not. Sin can contaminate everything, but righteousness, there has to be a special cleansing to get rid of sin. God started blessing the people the day the work of the building of the temple was resumed. Fourth message. Zerubbabel is used to picture a messianic prophecy on December the 18th. The Great Tribulation is coming, but the Messiah's rule in the millennium is to follow. Zerubbabel, or Zerubbabel, was God's signet ring, a special sign to show the resumption of the messianic line through David that was removed from Jehoiakim, was restored to Zerubbabel, and culminated in Messiah's reign in the millennium. That is the book of Haggai. Okay, I need everybody's attention because we are going to be speaking about Zechariah. He's the guy who is by the way, Zechariah was a contemporary of Haggai. Zechariah pronounced Zechariah and also Zechariahu means Jehovah remembers or remembered of Jehovah. Depending on the source, there are 25 to 32 people in the Bible whose name is Zechariah. 32 different people in the Bible with that name. Okay. Charles Feinberg lists 31 different Old Testament Zechariahs. The Zondervan Pictorial, in the Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible, he lists 31. Another Bible encyclopedia, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, lists 32 different Zechariahs. The one who prophesied with Haggai is number 19 on the list. So 19 out of 32. The prophet Zechariah is mentioned by name 6 times in the Old Testament. In other words, this particular Zechariah. If you count all the other Zechariahs, all 32 others, obviously it's a lot larger number, but we're focused on just this particular Zechariah who prophesied along with Haggai. So the prophet Zechariah is mentioned by name 6 times in the Old Testament, in Ezra chapter 5:1, 6:14, and in Zechariah he's mentioned in his own book in 1:1, verse 7, and chapter 7, verses 1 and 8. So the prophet Zechariah is mentioned by name 2 times in the New Testament by Jesus concerning the prophet's martyrdom. Jesus mentions this guy by name. He says that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. That's Matthew 23:35. And then in Luke, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the temple. Luke 11:51. So Jesus himself mentions this particular Zechariah.
What was the Matthew one?
Matthew 23:35. 9 verses from the book of Zechariah are scattered through the New Testament in 13 places and 5 different books. Does that sound confusing? 9 verses from the book of Zechariah are scattered through the New Testament in 13 places in 5 different books. 6 quotes in Matthew, 1 quote in Mark, 2 quotes in John, 1 quote in Ephesians, and 3 quotes in Revelation. Prophetic facts and the length of the book. Zechariah is divided into 14 chapters. And by the way, if you read some commentaries, they're going to say that Zechariah is longer than the book of Daniel, which only has 12 chapters. I am going to disprove that assertion right here. Okay? There's a total of 211 verses. There are 144 prophetic verses out of 211 verses, making Zechariah 69% prophetic. Zechariah, with its 211 verses, is the longest minor prophet book, beating number 2, Hosea's 197 verses. Zechariah falls far short of Daniel's 357 verses, being 146 verses less. So Zechariah is much shorter than Daniel. Zechariah presents a wide range of messianic prophecies and future events. The first and second comings of Christ are clearly set forth. The coming tribulation, the day of the Lord, is described in some long passages, and the millennial kingdom is described in several places. The MacArthur Study Bible states, quote, "This book is the most messianic, apocalyptic, and eschatological in the Old Testament." Unquote. Charles Ryrie, anybody ever have a copy of the Ryrie Study Bible? It was the Bible to have back in the 70s, okay, in the 80s. And you guys never heard of it? Obviously, it's not the Bible to have today then, right? Or you guys would all have one. Okay. So Charles Ryrie states, quote, "Zechariah predicted more about the Messiah than any other prophet except Isaiah," unquote. J. Vernon McGee states, quote, "This book has the characteristics of an apocalypse. The visions resemble those in the book of Daniel, Ezekiel, and Revelation," unquote. So in other words, it's a very prophetic book. When I teach Revelation, oftentimes I'll tell people that if you don't understand the book of Zechariah, it's going to be difficult to understand the book of Revelation. Most people will refer to Daniel numerous times when they teach Revelation, but they should be referring to Zechariah just as often. So let's look at the date and the author. The message of the book of Zechariah was from 520 to 518 BC. That's the messages in the book itself. Zechariah dates his messages precisely just as the prophet Haggai did during the rebuilding of the temple. Zechariah 1:1 states, "In the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius," in other words, Darius is Daryavesh. You need to wait for that time when you're in a Bible study where people are arguing, is it Darius or is it Darius? You need, so you can forthrightly say, no, it is Daryavesh. And I can prove it. You need to do that. People will just stand back and say, where did you get that information? Okay. Anyway, this gives a starting date no earlier than October the 27th, 527 BC. This is 2 months after the start of Haggai's prophecy, as can be seen in Haggai 1:1. So in other words, they date their prophecies and you can bump one against the other. The last dated message is in Zechariah 7:1, which states, "In the 4th year of King Daryavesh, the 4th day of the 9th month." This last recorded date is December the 7th, 518 BC. Charles L. Feinberg states, quote, "The length of his ministry is unknown." So that's, I put that quote first just to show you that when they have all these other explanations, you'll discover that they don't know. They're conjecturing or they're guessing or they're making educated guesses. The MacArthur Study Bible states, quote, "The length of his ministry is uncertain." So Feinberg says unknown. MacArthur Study Bible says uncertain. The last dated prophecy, 7:1, came approximately 2 years after the first, making them identical in time with Haggai's prophecy, 520 to 518 BC. Chapters 9 through 14, with variations in style and references to Greece, indicate a date of 480 to 470 BC. So in other words, he probably prophesied, another, from 518 to 470, that's almost 50 years. If this is true, Zechariah prophesied and ministered for nearly 50 years, 520 to 470 BC. Well into Xerxes' reign of 486 to 464, the king who made Esther queen of Persia. I never got a chance to tie in Esther, and so I thought that was, it didn't really apply to the prophets here, so I didn't talk about Esther, but everywhere I could, I got her in there. So let's look at a biography of Zechariah, or Zechariah, okay? Zechariah was the son of Berechiah and the grandson of Iddo the prophet. Berechiah, pronounced Berechiah, means blessed of Yahweh. In Zechariah 1:7, his name is pronounced Berechiahu. There's a lot of Yahu's in a lot of Hebrew names like Yeshayahu, that's really Isaiah. They all have Yahu at the end of their name. Okay. In other words, it's exciting to have those names, right? Yahu. Okay. Iddo, pronounced Iddo, okay, means timely or to meet according to appointment. Zechariah was a priest, just as Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who were also called by God to be prophets. So let's take a look at Zechariah's youth. Now, what does it mean when I say his youth? That's when he was young, right? When he was young. The MacArthur, well, he looks so serious. Okay. I like that. I like that in you, okay? The MacArthur Study Bible states, quote, he was born in Babylon and joined his grandfather Iddo in the group of 50,000 exiles who first returned to Jerusalem under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest. That's in Nehemiah 12:4. It is thought that his father Berechiah died at an early age before he could succeed his father into the priesthood. So his father died young. Feinberg, anybody know who Charles Feinberg is? Okay, he was a Messianic Jew. He was the president of Talbot Theological Seminary when Josh McDowell went through. And basically, Charles Feinberg discipled John MacArthur. That's why to me, that's why he's famous. John MacArthur quotes him a lot. Feinberg notes, quote, he is spoken of as a young man in Zechariah 2, verse 4, though no specific age can be gleaned from this reference. So he was young. So he could have been anywhere from, said young man, maybe anywhere from 18 to 30. If you compare him to Haggai, Haggai was probably older than me. So basically, Haggai, the old guy, had a young sidekick prophet. A very young prophet and a very old prophet. If Haggai saw Solomon's temple, then Haggai would have been remember the captivity was, the temple was destroyed in 586, and they're rebuilding the temple in 518. So you do the math and you can figure out that Haggai was probably pretty old. Haggai was probably a child when he saw the temple, Solomon's temple, burned and destroyed. Compared to Haggai, who had seen Solomon's temple 7 years prior, Zechariah was relatively young. Feinberg also notes, quote, Jewish tradition credits him with being one of the great synagogue, a body which is thought to have gathered and preserved the sacred writings and traditions of the Jews after the exile. MacArthur Study Bible states that, quote, the great synagogue, a council of 120, originated by Nehemiah and presided over by Ezra, developed into the ruling elders of the nation called the Sanhedrin. Zechariah may have ministered for nearly 50 years, well into the days of Queen Esther and King Xerxes. 486 to 464 BC. According to Jesus Christ's statements in the New Testament, he died a martyr being murdered between the temple and the altar. So he was born a priest, but he was murdered at the temple. By the way, there was another Zechariah who was also murdered at the temple, who was also a prophet. More than one prophet was named Zechariah. And in the Old Testament describes one. The death of Zechariah is not recorded. This Zechariah is not recorded in the Old Testament, but Jesus brings him up with his infallible sources of knowledge and stuff, so we can be rest assured that Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, was murdered at the temple. Let's take a look at the historical background and setting. So first of all, we have Jerusalem is destroyed in the captivity in Babylon, 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian army destroyed Jerusalem, the temple, and the nation of Judah's survivors were deported to Babylon for a period of 70 years. This was the start of the times of the Gentiles, according to Luke chapter 21, verse 24. In the return to Judah, Babylon capitulated to Persia in 539 BC. Now that's my word. I chose that word. Capitulated. Okay. Cyrus the Great decreed that the Jews could return to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple, but only 50,000 returned under Zerubbabel. Included in this group was Haggai and the younger priest prophet Zechariah. Then I give you a biography of Cyrus the Great, 559 to 530 BC. By the way, that's when he reigned, okay? Otherwise, he wouldn't have been a very old guy when he died. Cyrus is pronounced Koresh, okay? And means the sun. Now his is really easy to remember, Koresh. So let's take a look at the birth of Cyrus and his parents. There are many legends concerning Cyrus, but the account by Herodotus, the Greek historian, may be the most factual, and I got my information I got out of the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. He says, quote, Cyrus was the offspring of the marriage of Cambyses, the Persian vassal of the Median king Astyages, and Mandane, daughter of Astyages. So his parents were Cambyses, and his mother's name was Mandane. So let's take a look at Cyrus's empire, the Medes and the Persians. In 549 BC, he conquered his mother's father, which makes his grandfather, right? He conquered his mother's father, Astyages, who was a Median king, founding the Persian, the Achaemenid Empire. They call it it's the Achaemenid. That's the name of the official name of the Persian Empire. He conquered Croesus and his kingdom of Lydia. Does anybody remember stories of King Croesus? Remember everything he touched turned to gold? Ever heard that? That's that guy. And he was the king of Lydia. And in 547, he marched through Assyria, and on October the 16th, 539, Persians entered Babylon 17 days later. So he helped in conquering, he conquered literally what was left of the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. So let's take a look at Cyrus's Jewish policy. Exiles were restored to their homes and their gods to their restored temples. It wasn't just the Jews themselves, but he did that for all the people who were deported from their homelands. He gave permission for all of these people to go back and to rebuild their temples and rebuild their lands. In other words, this made him the good guy. So in other words, he was seen as a liberator to a lot of these other nations. After having Babylon conquer you and Assyria, having been conquered by Syria and having deporting your population, Cyrus comes in and frees everybody. They were seen as liberators. So exiles were restored to their homes and their gods to their restored temples. The Jews, having no images, were allowed to restore their temple and its fittings. Let's take a look at the death of Cyrus, 530 BC. According to Herodotus, Cyrus was defeated and killed in a battle with the Mesogetae, one of the tribes on his northeastern frontier. In other words, a lot of these kings, they fought, they led their armies, in the front, and basically he died that way. On Cyrus's tombstone, it reads, quote, "I am Cyrus, who won for the Persians their empire. Do not begrudge me this little earth that covers my corpse." That's what it says on his tombstone. Cyrus in Scripture. Cyrus is mentioned by name 23 times in 4 different books of the Old Testament. 2 Chronicles 3 times, Ezra 15 times, Isaiah 2 times, and Daniel 3 times. God called Cyrus my anointed and my shepherd. Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1. The Jews. The Levitical sacrifices commenced on a rebuilt altar shortly after the 50,000 captives returned to Jerusalem. In the second year of their return, the temple foundation was laid. Opposition from enemies and Jewish apathy halted the temple work for 16 years. In 520 BC, God raised up Haggai and Zechariah. The temple was completed March 12, 515 BC, largely due to the prophets, Haggai and Zechariah's encouraging messages from God. Here's what some pastors say about the theological themes for Zechariah. Charles Swindoll. Anybody know who Charles Swindoll is? He used to be in Southern California, outside of Disneyland, not Anaheim, but the next city over. He had a church there where he had a radio show called Insights for Living, and he finally left there, and then it's been 20 years now. I guess he's been in Plano, Texas. Plano, Texas. Okay, not plain old Texas. Okay, which is like something. Was it northwest of Dallas or something like that? Okay. Charles Swindoll states, God's sovereignty, the coming Messiah. That's what he states in his Living Insights study Bible. Okay. Chuck Smith. Does everybody know who Chuck Smith is? What? Never heard of him before? Once you listen to all those Chuck tapes, basically your minds are just erased, right? Okay. Chuck Smith states, quote, Zechariah's encouragement was rooted in the ultimate restoration occurring along with the coming Messiah. Tim LaHaye, does everybody know who Tim LaHaye is? Tim LaHaye, Prophecy Study Bible. Tim LaHaye, the Left Behind series. You don't?
I've seen some of the movies when I was little.
Is there more than one movie?
Is there not?
I don't know.
3 and then the new one.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, and so Delilah, you know Tim LaHaye from his writing, okay. Anyway, Tim LaHaye says, quote, God's future plans for his people, the ultimate blessing coming upon Israel through the first and second comings of Christ. The MacArthur Study Bible, calling the people to repentance and reassuring them regarding future blessings. So I gave you 4 different themes there you can pick for your paper. Remember when you're talking about the prophet, it says, what are they writing about? Just go right for the theme. It's like go right for the jugular vein. I mean, you nail it right on the spot. That's what the book's about. That's the theme. Let's take a look at an outline of Zechariah's, the book, okay? First of all, there's an introduction, the first 6 verses. Then he has 8 night visions. Okay, in other words, there's going to be in one night, God is going to give him a series of 8 visions. Does this remind you of like A Christmas Carol? Scrooge. He only had 3 visions, right? Three ghosts visited him. Zechariah has 8 different visions in one night. Okay. Then in chapters 7 and 8, there are 4 messages that Zechariah gives, and they have to do with, and you'll all be interested in this since I just heard sort of haphazardly that you're all doing this, 4 messages about fasting. Zechariah chapter 7 and 8. You might want to check those out and just see if what you're doing, how biblical is what you're doing, okay? I'm just joking with you, of course. Okay. Then there are two burdens of Zechariah, chapters 9 through 14, and these are literally going to be referring to the first and second comings of Christ, but they're much more a narrative form versus the visions. I really wish I've had the opportunity to, like in a semester, teach the book of Zechariah. It is a fascinating book, but what we're going to do is we're just going to look at Zechariah in a nutshell. That's a colloquial expression, because it's not literally in a nutshell, but literally we're going to there's a self-contained message here. Okay. So this is a summary of Zechariah. The introduction, chapters 1 through 6. Israel had paid a high price for the sin of disobeying God's commands. God was asking the Jews to repent and not be like their fathers. That's basically what verses 1 through 6 is about. Are you yawning in my class? Okay. Okay. Want to open the door? The air is getting kind of stale in here. I'd probably be yawning too if I was sitting down. I'll kind of flap the door a little bit to get some air in here. Okay. Okay. Probably knock the door off the hinges, huh? Okay. Okay. Then there are 8 night visions of Zechariah, and I'm just going to list what they are. I might comment on 1 or 2 of them. First of all, there's going to be the vision of the horses, chapter 1, verses 7 through 17. You don't need to write these down, by the way. After this, I'm going to pass the handout out. I can always tell that after the handout is passed out, there's way fewer notes being taken. And says, oh, it's already there. Okay. That's why I wait so long to do it, so that way I know the act of writing will actually keep your eyes open in class. Then there's the vision of the 4 horns, okay? And I'm going to interpret that for you. The 4 horns. Horns represent power, political power, military power. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And you're going to discover that there's going to be the 4 horns and 4 craftsmen. Yes?
How come Assyria isn't considered in those ones?
Because Zechariah is writing well after the Assyrian Empire is no longer on the scene. He's referring to what's future.
Oh, okay.
And the reason why he mentions Babylon is because when he talks about the 4 craftsmen, the 4 craftsmen are going to be, like for instance, if the first horn is Babylon, the first craftsman or the first carpenter is going to be Medo-Persia. Medo-Persia took apart the Babylonian Empire. The second horn, Medo-Persia, was taken apart by Greece, which was the third horn. The third horn, Greece, was pulled apart by Rome, the fourth horn. The fourth horn, Rome, is pulled apart by the 4th craftsman, who is Messiah himself. Okay, that's just to show you that some of these interpretations aren't too difficult. Then there's a vision of a measuring line where literally every time there's a measuring going on in a prophecy or something like that, God is getting ready to judge a specific area or give a prophecy about a specific area. Then there's the vision of Joshua, the high priest. Okay. By the way, Joshua, the high priest, and who is he? His name is Jesus. He is going to be crowned a king. So, in other words, it's going to be a prophecy of when Messiah, Jesus, is literally going to be crowned king. Then there's the vision of the lampstand and the olive trees. If you go to Revelation chapter 11, it talks about the 2 witnesses, the 2 olive trees. It goes right back to this vision. And in Zechariah 4:6, remember you hear that statement, not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, says Jehovah. You all know that verse, right? Zechariah 4:6. Okay. Then there's the vision of the flying scroll. In other words, it's like a copy of the 10 Commandments that God is using, sending out over the earth. which is his standard that he uses to judge all the peoples of the earth. Then there is the vision of the woman in the basket, chapter 5, verses 5 through 11. This ties in very closely with Revelation chapter 17, the great harlot, the mother of all harlots, okay? Basically, it's right here where you learn that the great harlot will, just before judgment, will return to her roots, to Babylon itself, to the land of Shinar. It's in this vision where God is saying that before mystery religion is completely destroyed off the face of the earth, it will be destroyed at its roots in Babylon. Then there's the vision of the 4 chariots, and then there's the crowning of Joshua, which is a picture of the branch man, a picture of Messiah the branch. Okay. Then there's going to be 4 messages of Zechariah, chapters 7 and 8. First message, it concerns fasting in the 5th and the 7th months. The disobedience brought captivity, restoration from captivity, and then the fast will one day become feasts. By the way, in the feast, the fasting in the 5th and the 7th month, they were saying, do we need to be fasting in the 5th and the 7th months? And why aren't you blessing us for this fasting? God says, I didn't command you to fast in the 5th and the 7th month. I didn't tell you to do that. So I mean, that's how it starts. And then and God goes into what's the purpose of fasting. If you're doing it just to get something, it's for the wrong purpose, et cetera, et cetera. Then we have 2 burdens of Zechariah, Messiah's first coming, the redemption of the Jews. Here you see the typical prophecies of Messiah coming in on a colt, the foal of a colt, riding on a humble like a donkey, and he's going to be contrasted with Alexander the Great riding a white horse. In reference to like Alexander the Great riding on a white horse, the Messiah will come in lowly riding on a donkey. And then it describes Messiah's second coming, chapters 11 through 14, which refers to the second coming of the Lord. And that's the whole book of Zechariah. There is a possibility we'll be done early today. Okay. I've got 42 pages on Malachi I got to go through. But
42?
That's kidding. Okay. Okay, I'm going to pass the hand.
Even longer than the book itself.
Yeah. I'm going to pass out the handouts right now so I don't forget. If you ever decide you want the actual Hebrew in there, you'll just have to get with me personally or something like that.
You stopped doing it.
I didn't think anybody was interested in it, so I just stopped doing it. I mean, I did it with mine, but were you interested in it?
I can look them up.
Yeah, it's easy to look up. Huh? Well, every time I kept asking, I kept getting this blank stare, like, hey, would you guys like the Hebrew? Nobody'd say anything, and so I just thought I was going too deep. Okay. Okay.
I'm generous.
You are. Okay. Kalina, you're welcome. Oscar.
Thank you.
And Lauren. Okay. Okay, so you now have all the handouts for all the prophets. I have given you the entire syllabus for this course, word for word. Okay.
Now I have to go back to the coffee room.
Go ahead. Well, you'll have plenty of time because we're going to be done early. Okay. It's already copied for you.
I had to punch the holes in it. So
Oh, I understand. Mine have holes punched already, and mine, they're just on one side, too. Okay. Okay, we are in the book of Malachi, okay. Pronounce Malachi, or you can say Malachi, but actually it's, if you look at the vowels, it's actually Malachi. But but you can say Malachi too. It means my messenger or messenger of Jehovah, or you can say my angel. Okay. Because Malach is that's the Hebrew word for angel. Does anybody know the Greek word for angel? Angelos, it's angel, right? The English word for angel is angel, right? It means or messenger. That's, yeah.
Malak. In my language,
Uh-huh.
Malak.
So it's kind
That's
of close to
Hebrew.
the
Yeah.
So is Malach angel?
So in his in Tephra's language, it's the same as it is in Hebrew, Malach. Okay. So, by the way, on that pronunciation, look at the sources here. Jones's Dictionary of Old Testament Proper Names, page 236. Judson and Cornwell and Stillman Smith, the Exhaustive Dictionary of Bible Names, and Strong's Exhaustive Concordance Hebrew Dictionary, Strong's number 4401, page 159. I checked out I bumped it against 4 different sources, and actually I used 5 sources. I also use the Complete Jewish Bible. They have like a pronouncing guide in the back, and I always bump all these different guides together to see if they say the same thing. And sometimes they don't. So the MacArthur Study Bible notes, quote, some have suggested that the book was written anonymously, noting that the name meaning my messenger could be a title rather than a proper name, unquote. 3 passages in Malachi together have been quoted 6 times in the New Testament. Malachi chapter 1 verses 2 and 3 is quoted in Romans chapter 9:13. Malachi 3:1 is quoted in Matthew 11:10, Mark 1:2, and Luke 1:76 and 7:27. And Malachi 5 and 6 is quoted in Luke 1:17. Okay. Malachi is mentioned by name only once in the Bible in Malachi 1:1. In other words, he's the only Malachi in the entire Bible. And of course, you've all heard the joke, what is the only Italian book in the Bible? Malachi. Malachi, right? Okay. Yeah. So, prophetic facts and length of the book. Roman numeral 2. Malachi is divided into 4 chapters, at least in a English Bible. Total of 55 verses. There are 19 prophecies. There are 31 prophetic verses out of 55 verses, making Malachi 56% prophetic. Malachi is ranked 8th in length in the minor prophets. Malachi speaks of the future tribulation coming upon the earth before Messiah comes. In the first advent, Malachi speaks of my messenger in 1:3, who is identified as John the Baptist in the New Testament. Malachi 3:1 is quoted by Jesus in Matthew 11:10 and Luke 7:27. In the second advent, in other words, the second coming of Christ, Malachi speaks of Elijah the prophet being sent before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Does anybody know what the day of the Lord is? Great Tribulation. Okay. Date and, yeah.
So did you say there was going to be great tribulation before Jesus came back? That's what Malachi says?
No.
Well,
The tribulation will occur before Jesus comes back.
okay.
He comes back at the end of the Great Tribulation.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Unless you're one of these people with a strange mid-trib position where Jesus comes in the middle of the 7-year period. In which case, the mid-trib rapture position would state that. You're not one of those people, are you?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
What is that?
Date and author, okay? I'm just teasing you. Okay.
I couldn't tell.
Okay.
You're joking.
I look so serious. I know nobody knows when I'm joking. I constantly am telling my wife, that was a joke. Oh, was it really? Okay.
I think after a long time living with you, she'd know, right?
No, I said, there was a joke that Germans don't tell jokes. I look at Delilah and I know that's not true. But I look at my wife and I say, well, there might be something to that. Because my wife does not joke. She just is not a a joker.
But she has a sense of humor.
Yeah, she has a sense of humor, but she doesn't like jokes. She grew up on a farm in Oregon. She was a rural person, and she was the farmer's daughter, the butt of all those kinds of jokes and everything. So she doesn't like jokes. Date and author: 437 to 417 BC. The MacArthur Study Bible states. Did you notice that I quoted preponderously from this Bible? Oh, notice that. Nobody caught that? No. Okay. If you actually go through and count the quotes, I haven't actually counted the quotes. I've discovered that I'm not pushing that you buy this Bible, but boy, it has the best notes. I mean, they're very, very specific. They hold a very specific position, and they're very detailed, and you can learn a lot of information just from the notes. They're very scholarly notes. They quote profusely from Keil and Delitzsch's commentary of the Old Testament, the German scholars. Okay, they are the standard for Old Testament commentaries. So when you go back to Germany, you remind people of that. Okay. Okay.
It's not a Reformation in Germany.
Huh?
It's not a Reformation.
Yeah, you could restart a Reformation just with those Old Testament commentaries. But it's not New Testament, though, it's Old Testament. Okay. MacArthur's Study Bible states, quote, looking solely at internal evidence, the date of the prophecy points to the late 5th century BC, most likely during Nehemiah's return to Persia in 433 to 424 BC. And I quoted a bunch of different people, because like when you get to a position where nobody really knows, I quote a lot of people. That's how I make it more scholarly. I just quote a lot of people that don't know. Okay? So Chuck Smith states, quote, Malachi was prophesying around 400 BC during the final days of Nehemiah's leadership. So we got 433 to 424, got 400 BC. Both Charles Ryrie and Tim LaHaye assigned dates of 450 to 400 BC. I kind of put those two together. J. Vernon McGee states, quote, there is some difference of opinion about the time at which Malachi wrote. The date that I suggest is 397 BC, which is probably a late date. So I quote a bunch, which sounds pretty like they really know what they're talking about. Then I quote McGee saying there's a big difference of opinion as when he wrote it, and then he gives a very late date, okay, 397 BC. Author, we have, I put here, I'm going to start doing this, I'm going to go back and redo this. The author, date of birth, unknown. His death, unknown. So that narrows it down. At least we can get the right century, but we don't know when he was born and when he died. Charles L. Feinberg states, quote, nothing is known of the personal history of the prophet. Nothing is known, and now you'll hear the theories that immediately go after it. This is what makes it scholarly, okay? Since the priesthood is prominent in the book, some have thought Malachi was a priest. The Aramaic Targum of Jonathan considers that Ezra the scribe was Malachi. Jewish tradition makes Malachi with Haggai and Zechariah a member of the great synagogue who collected and preserved the scriptures. No prophetic book of the Old Testament has come down to us anonymously, so we can hold with assurance that Malachi was the name of the last prophet in Israel. What's his reasoning? There is no other anonymous books, so obviously Malachi is not anonymous either. But nobody knows really who he was. What can be said of Malachi with some certainty is that he was a contemporary of Nehemiah and the post-exilic community of Jews in the years 450 to 400 BC. One source states, and if you look down at the bottom it says the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. And the reason why I put one source states is I didn't want to put that at the front. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says, quote, the book itself provides very little information about the prophet. Presumably, he lived in or near Jerusalem and had an intimate knowledge of worship practices in the temple. So out of all of these sources, did you notice that nobody really knows? That was just to show you that it's not just one or two persons' opinions. The general opinion is that we know very little about this guy. Craig A. Blazing, anybody know that guy? Walvoord and Zuck, Bible Knowledge Commentary. He wrote the commentary on Malachi. Okay? The contents of the book of Malachi clearly indicate that it was written by a prophet. It says he was definitely a prophet. We know that. Nothing is known of his family line, and he is not mentioned by name elsewhere in the Bible. Okay? That's what he says. But he was a prophet. We know that. So what do we know about Malachi? He was a prophet who probably lived from 450 to 400 BC. Historical background and setting. The MacArthur Study Bible notes, quote, only 50,000 exiles had returned to Judah from Babylon in 538 to 536 BC. The temple had been rebuilt under the leadership of Zerubbabel in 516 BC and the sacrificial system renewed. Ezra had returned in 458 BC, followed by Nehemiah in 445 BC. That's the background and setting. Craig A. Blazing states, quote, most likely in Malachi's day, the wall of Jerusalem was being rebuilt or had been completed. So he was possibly around while the wall was being put up. A century after Cyrus the Great, does anybody remember Cyrus's, the way he would pronounce his name? Koresh, okay? A century after Koresh the Great issued his decree in 538 BC, the worship in the temple had become mundane and ritualistic. In other words, I didn't quote it, but I like the way J. Vernon McGee describes it. The worshipers came to the temple. Oh, well, what a bore. God is in the Holy of Holies. Oh, what a bore listening to these people. Basically, that's how he describes it. That's Texas humor, okay? Okay. So in other words, the people were bored with God, and God says, I'm bored with you. Okay. That's a lot more dangerous that I'm bored with you than it is that you're bored with me. Craig A. Blazing states, quote, life was not easy. The Jews were under the political dominion of Persia. Harvests were poor and subject to locust damage. Now, if you can remember from the book of Haggai, since I didn't go through the book verse by verse, God mentions the fact, when he's dealing with nations that, I was trying to get your attention and get your priorities straight, so I sent plagues of locusts. I sent drought. I sent famine. I sent inflation. God says, this is ways that he uses to get your attention. He says, still you didn't listen. Okay, so and then he sends the prophet, but he did all those other things first. But God basically states throughout the prophets that when he wants to get a nation's attention, he will start doing those sorts of things. He will send plague, he'll send drought, he'll send famine, and he'll send inflation. Okay, amongst a lot of other things. That fly's been bothering me for the last 2 hours. We need to kill it. It needs to die. Because, yeah, that's Satan in the room right there. Lord of the Flies, okay? Okay. 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 A century, okay. Craig A. Blazing states, I already read that, let's look at the people's heart attitudes. I didn't know whether to put the people's hearts attitudes or the people's heart attitudes. My wife and I, we argue about, is there supposed to be an apostrophe after that or not? Blazing states, quote, most hearts were indifferent or resentful toward God. Both the priests and the people were violating the stipulations of the Mosaic law regarding sacrifices, tithes, and offerings. In other words, they weren't taking seriously the Mosaic covenant. Marriages to foreign wives and easy divorce were common, as well as a laxity in moral values. In other words, a lot of the things that started causing, that caused the Jews to be deported from their land in the first place, they were very quickly starting to do the same thing again. So anyway, in the situation of easy divorce, laxity in moral values, does that sound common in this country?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, into this situation, Malachi spoke. Okay. Theological themes. Charles Swindoll succinctly identifies Malachi's key theme, quote, God's passionate love and God's call for justice. MacArthur Study Bible, the MacArthur Study Bible notes, quote, and again dealing with themes, quote, God's love for his people pervades the book. They thought that this love relationship could be maintained by formal ritual alone, no matter how they lived, unquote. The MacArthur Study Bible also states, the prophet reminds them that the Lord's coming, which they were seeking, would be in judgment to refine, purify, and purge. In other words, you might be looking for his coming, but when he comes, kind of bit like, like being like Amos, where Amos said, prepare to meet your God. In other words, it was not going to be a happy day. The Lord not only wanted outward compliance with the law, but an inward acceptance as well. And 3, Charles Ryrie sums up the theme of Malachi by writing, quote, Malachi rebuked the people for their neglect of true worship of the Lord and called them to repentance. Okay. So let's take a look at an outline of Malachi. And my outline is out of this. It's modified from this little book right here, textbook from last term. 1, God declares his love for Israel. 2, God disciplines the unfaithful priests. The lawbreakers, the backsliders are denounced. And then, of course, the last one, there's a final warning of judgment. Let's take a look at a commentary of Malachi. Okay, we're almost done. We're going to finish early. Okay, a commentary on Malachi. Okay, God declares his love for Israel, first 5 verses. This message is a burden, not one of comfort. God's love for Israel is demonstrated in his choice of Jacob, Israel, over Esau, his brother. God will once again be magnified in Israel. Remember one book where I talked about where a lot of the prophecies are burdens? If there's judgment coming, it is a burden. But there's one prophet that doesn't say that. His name means burden. Remember? Who was that? Amos? Amos? Yeah. Good. That's right.
Yeah, I like the name, but I don't like the meaning.
Burden, yeah. A heavy load, right? Is that noise out there excessive? Is it bothering you? It's what?
That's an Amos. That voice out there is an Amos.
Oh. Can we close the door for maybe? Yeah.
We're stuck in here with the fly.
What's that?
The fly's stuck in here with us.
I know. I think the fly likes the heat.
Here, if you end quick,
What's that?
that's the sooner you can get away from the fly.
Are you giving me a prophetic statement?
Holy speaking reason here.
Okay. I like that. Okay. Okay. B. God disciplines the unfaithful priests. Verses 1:6 to 2:9. The priests were guilty of serious sins. They brought blemished offerings to the Lord. If when you read this is really funny. They, whether it's a farmer, a rancher, or whether it's somebody else, somebody might say, "Oh, man, this bull broke his leg. He's old. He's going to die in a week or two. I know. I'll give him to the Lord. I'll give him for a sacrifice to the Lord." That's basically what they were doing. And then even when they did that, the priests were, well, I'll just keep this for me. Lord doesn't need that, and I'll just give him this old one. Priests were doing that too. And God says, try doing that to your governor. See how he likes it. See what he does. Okay. Governor. Like the governor of the.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Like Nehemiah, the governor, or something like that. Whoever was the leader of the country, of the head of the province of Judea at that time. So God says, try giving that sacrifice to him and see how he appreciates it. And then much more, if he doesn't appreciate it, what makes you think I'm going to appreciate it? Because God says you're supposed to give your best to God. The tithe of the tithe, the best of the best. Where the cream rises to the top, the cream goes to God. Okay.
So would you say that kind of shows God's mercy in a sense?
It shows his grace, his mercy, his long suffering. Mostly it shows his long suffering. In other words, long suffering, the definition is, for instance, as a teacher, I could be long suffering. And say everybody in this classroom, nobody's paying attention. I have the power to do you great harm, but I'm choosing not to. That's long suffering. That's what it means, okay? God is long suffering. And all of you, by the way, you're all long suffering. Yes, say you have power to hurt somebody, but you're choosing not to. That's long suffering. Sometimes it's translated patience, but patience can mean a lot of things. Patience can mean like there's a whole lot of stuff that's coming upon you, and you're patiently enduring it, and that's different than long suffering. Long suffering is much more specific. So, then it says the Jews disregarded the laws of Jehovah. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. Then God denounces backsliders. In other words, everybody know what a backslider is? By the way, that term backslider, I didn't bring it up, but the term backslider is first introduced in the book of Amos. And it refers to like you're like a backsliding heifer. And you have to picture like you're trying to pull up a young cow up a ramp or something like that, and it's just refusing to come up. It keeps sliding back. And so that God kind of like when he says backslider, says you're just like that. It's an Amos. I don't know the verse. Also like in Amos, unless two can't walk together unless they be agreed. And there was this typical where God wants to, and it's in Hosea 2, where God kind of like puts his hand on your shoulder so that you'll stop and so he can reason with you, but you jerk your shoulder away and won't turn around and face God. Basically, that's how God said his people were. Basically, they were resisting any kind of wise counsel from God. Jewish husbands were guilty of divorcing their Jewish wives, the Jewish wives of their youth to marry Gentile younger women. So in other words, the older Jewish men divorced the wives of their youth, in other words, the women that they married when they were young, so that they could marry younger women. Okay. This was, by the way, this was a big issue in the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. Remember, there were a number of times they had that problem where the husbands, remember, and even in the Gospels, remember the Jews said, is it lawful for a man to be able to divorce his wife for just any reason? You know, Matthew 19. Remember, Jesus came down hard. There were two positions on that. And there was the one position that said you couldn't divorce for any reason at all. And the one that said, my wife burned the hamburgers, divorce her. You know, there was that kind of position. It really was that easy. She didn't put on makeup this morning, divorce her. You know, just it was that easy. In other words, women didn't have the right to divorce in Jewish society, but the men did. So they asked Jesus that question, so that basically he wanted to turn the crowd. So Jesus gives God's opinion of divorce. First of all, he says, Malachi, remember, says God hates divorce. He accommodated it, but he says he hates it. And then Jesus went and said that if you divorce anybody except for the cause of fornication or immorality, the Greek word porneia, in other words, any kind of a lifestyle of sexual deviancy, that is the only way that you have to divorce a wife, is under those, well, either way, for divorce to be legal in God's eyes, which the Jews did not want to hear. Okay. By the way, I always like, when I do marriage counseling, when I turn to say Malachi 2:14, it's the husbands divorcing their older wives and marrying younger women, but in Proverbs 2:17, it's the wayward wife who's very loose in her morals, that is, who has left her husband by covenant. In both places, it's wife by covenant, husband by covenant, but God uses in each case, he describes the purpose of marriage as being one of companionship, is the number one reason for marriage. Companionship. It is not good for the man to be alone. Number one reason for marriage. So God, throughout the scripture, he hits it over again and again, and Jesus says in Matthew chapter 19, what God has joined together, don't let man put asunder. So God is saying, don't let anybody come between the relationship between you and your wife. And like I said, when I'm marriage counseling, I said that also includes the husband and wife. Don't let the husband terminate a marriage, and don't let the wife terminate the marriage. He says, let no man, no person do that. So God is, he hits that big in Malachi. Then he says God was being robbed of tithes and offerings. Oh, there's a parenthesis in here. The first advent, or the coming of the Messiah, a messenger, John, the first advent coming messenger, John the Baptist. In other words, John the Baptist announced the first coming of Christ. And then we go back to the main theme. God was being robbed of tithes and offerings. In other words, the people robbed God. The people saw no benefit in serving God. God remembers forever those who fear him. I want to read that one part. There's a really... Did anybody hear the pastor's sermon yesterday? And remember John 11:35, Jesus wept, shortest verse in the New Testament. Actually, if you look at the Greek says Jesus shed tears. That's what it says. But an English way of saying that is Jesus wept. Okay. So anyway, I tell people, by the way, if it's good enough for Jesus, it ought to be good enough for you. So if you hear people say, I can't cry, I've got to be strong for everybody, that's not biblical. If Jesus could openly weep in front of everybody, and would anybody doubt that he was not being strong? Would you say that he was a weakling doing that? Okay, it hits manhood right in the heart here in this country, where the John Wayne sort of thing is destroyed at that point there. What was I going to turn to? Oh yeah, Malachi. Malachi. I was doing all that talking that you do while you're trying to find the page, and I forgot to turn the page. Okay, but in Malachi here, if I can find it, oh yeah, Malachi 3:16. Then those who feared the Lord spoke to one another, and the Lord listened and heard them. So a book of remembrance was written before him for those who fear the Lord and who meditate on his name. Okay, so he, that's not the verse I was looking for. Oh well, you'll just have to find it on your own. Anyway, it states that Jesus collects your tears in a bottle, so to speak, and he remembers them forever. He does not forget. By the way, who wants to leave a legacy when you die? Does anybody know what that is? Do you want people to remember you? I mean, the pharaohs of Egypt, they wanted people to remember them. They built the pyramids and everything, right? People they like to do really great things so that they will be remembered forever and ever. In Psalm 112, verse 6, God states that if you're a believer, he says your memorial, your memory will be forever. You will be remembered forever. In other words, God makes sure you will be immortalized and remembered forever if you're his child. So that's, God kind of like takes care of that. Psalm 112, 6. Then we have the final warning of judgment, chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. A second reminder that the messenger Elijah is coming before the day of the Lord to prepare the way for the second coming of Messiah. And that's how the Old Testament ends, literally ending with a curse. Lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. That's the way the Old Testament ends in our English Bibles, in our Protestant Bibles. Okay, we have covered the Old Testament prophets, but not in great detail, but we are finished with them. Is there any questions? Any questions at all? Going once.
What do you
What? Go ahead.